Welcome back, everybody, to my journey on the way to the courts of chaos. We are continuing with the Chronicles of Amber, and while you're watching this, I'm probably feverishly planning the rest of my trip to, the courts of chaos in wonderful Brittany, that part of France that is desperately trying to not be France and be as Celtic as possible. So yeah. We'll see how this goes, but tonight it's time to talk, or today it's time to talk about book 2 in the first series of the Chronicles of Amber, and that is the wonderfully titled The Guns of Avalon. So, shall we do this? I believe we shall. Cheers. Alright, so after giving you a bit of a synopsis when we talked about Nine Princes in Amber, today we're not going to do this. This is a series. You're supposed to read book 1, so you don't need a synopsis for book 2, because ideally you'll just continue. Plus, you already kind of know what's going to happen, because book 1 ends with Corwin fleeing his imprisonment with his regenerated eyes and vowing to bring guns to Amber. So, obviously, this book is all about getting the guns. I mean, the plotline is, as I said, fairly simple. So I assume you have read it or you don't mind. Corwin sets up all kinds of plans to get, well, gunpowder that actually works in Amber, because supposedly normal firearms don't work in Amber. But he has found a workaround in, like, one of the Shadow Worlds. He's found something that actually blows up in the world of Amber. So he's, started building this really complicated plot on how to get it done. And he achieves that. He arrives back in Amber, and he finally, is caught up by a lot of his mistakes. Great, right? So I want to, look at a bunch of themes in this one that, once again, I feel can be, exemplified by the Guns of Avalon. Another one of those things why I think the Chronicles of Amber in general are an amazing story, apart from just the plotline, which is already pretty cool. So that's what we're going to do today. And the first one is pop culture and cultural references. Now, this is obviously something that has already happened in book 1. I just didn't talk about it back then. But because of the setup that we have here, and it's, as I said, a similar setup to, say, the multiverses that someone like Michael Moorcock created, is that you can always mix up magic with our world. You can reference stuff. Yes, you can reference the Holocaust, which is exactly what Roger Zelazny tends to do again and again. But you can also reference, painters, psychologists, all these kind of things, or pieces of art. There's a lot of quotes in these books that are more or less direct quotes from Shakespeare tragedies or comedies. There's a lot of Shakespeare references in here. There's obviously all kinds of other things here, and I think why I want to bring this up is that we're talking once again about a period where, like, a lot of the subgenres that we are faced with today do not really exist because no one needs them. It's fantasy, and it's read by everyone who likes stuff that is not literary fiction or crime fiction. It is very much, it overlaps with science fiction. It overlaps with all kinds of other things, and yeah, for example, it also overlaps with what you might call, urban fiction and urban fantasy today, right? Because what we have here is that the super powerful supernatural being, Corwin of Amber, goes to our world to get firearms, moves to the mythical world of Avalon, and then brings guns to his fantasy realm. So is this urban fantasy? Is this gunpowder fantasy? Is it a Arthurian retelling? Yes, all of it, and more, so much more. I think it's one of the things that I love so much about Chronicles of Amber. It's one of the things that I love about a lot of these earlier, like 60s, 70s, sometimes even 50s science fiction fantasy authors is that they are like much more willing to go all over the place and play whatever just crosses their path in all kinds of ways. And I guess part of that is that the audience has shifted. The way fantasy is marketed these days has shifted a lot, and it's much more important to fit into a specific category if you want to actually sell your stuff in a lot of ways. And that creative freedom is something that you obviously also get with, say, music at the same time. You listen to music from the 60s or 70s, and it's sometimes very hard to define what kind of subgenre of music you're talking about, right? It's like, is Deep Purple hard rock? Is it progressive rock? Is it bluesy? Is it maybe even already something like heavy metal? We don't know. They don't care. Same for like all kinds of bands of the times. It's like, you just go wherever, and it's super easy to talk about this time as a more, free or naive, or not naive is probably the wrong word, but like more, a freer, more open world where people did not fear all kinds of problems. It's easy to do that. It's easy to romanticize the 70s, 60s, and 70s like that. I don't think that's the right approach, but it certainly shows that we sometimes go through certain periods of creative freedom before the system that we face with the publication system and whatnot. The brutal machinations of capitalism just rein in all those creative ideas of humanity. It's like something that happens again and again. If you want to, go and read big books that people in cultured magazines think are worth your time, go read some Thomas Pynchon, and he deals with that kind of stuff a lot. But I feel it's interesting to see the way these things, show up in something like Amber, or in something like the Eternal Champion series by Michael Moorcock, who even, has his interactions with bands like Hawkwind, where he certainly does participate in what you might call experimentation with recreational, chemistry as well as herbage, I guess. Point is, segregation of different pieces of, or like facets of art, has not really happened yet, and The Guns of Avalon, I feel, is a wonderful book to show all of that. It obviously displays the same kind of thing that we see in the first book, which is the pacing is very unfamiliar to what you might do today. This is still like a 200-page book, something will probably be sold as a novella by someone like Brandon Sanderson these days. It's short, and a lot of it happens. We have like 3 major battles. We have some interludes and stuff, and all of that fits in there, which is tons, really. Now I want to come and look at some other aspects here. Another one here is something that I might call like the anti-hero like trope, in a way. Like, all of these characters are, if you want to look at them, like grey or anti-heroes. And why is that a big thing? Well, technically it's not, but it kind of becomes something like that again when you compare it to, say, like popular stuff like Lord of the Rings at the times. Like, what with like people with superpowers? Wouldn't they, turn out to be assholes? The answer is, yeah, probably. So let's look at that some more. And the way this is set up with the family of the Princess of Amber all intriguing against each other. What Roger Zelazny does, and he does especially well with this novel, I feel, is to show us that while those people may have superhuman strength, superhuman powers of all kinds, at the end of the day, they are still human and fallible, because their emotions are still like the petty things that we humans drag around with us. And when you look at at this specific book, the Guns of Avalon, what you see here is exactly that. Corwin is driven by his need of vengeance. He wants to, avenge himself against Eric and become King of Amber. That's his goal. And we already seen him lose his death curse. And we've seen how that already affects it. And we see this exactly going throughout this story, because each of these chapters, so to speak, chapters, I mean, there's obviously chapters, but I mean like these three large stages: the place in Lorraine, the place in Avalon, and then the place finally in Amber, show different stages and effects of Corwin's curse. Right, we have the whole part of like the black circle in Lorraine that he beats back with his friend Ganelon together, and then we move on to Avalon, where his brother has already done, Benedict has already done part of that, but we have the encounter with Dara, possibly, and we encounter the Black Road, and then we go to actual Amber at the end, where there is a pitched battle for the fate of Amber, and Corwin just arrives at the absolute end. And it's important to see that that is actually the point where Amber is almost going to be destroyed, where he finally realizes the consequences of his death curse and his and actually takes it seriously, because up until this point, whenever one of his brothers says like, dude, we need to like postpone like internal struggles and stuff because there's shit going down that needs solving right now, Corwin's always like, yeah, you're right, I'll ignore you and I'll do my own thing anyway. And he marches to Amber with his army to kill Eric, not to defend Amber. He just like in the last second, sort of selfishly, let's not forget that he's like, you know what, if I show up as a savior now and Eric is maybe almost dead, I'll be, you know, sort of the savior. It'll really help my plans. So what we see there is how very egotistical, how egotistical Corwin is. Now, not all of the others are like that, but most of the others seem to be at least thinking in that way. And I think that's an important difference to, say, further, like earlier anti-heroes. Like, let's talk about, say, like someone like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, who are certainly not the white knights that they sometimes show up as. They're sort of greyish. Or someone like Kugel the Clever in Jack Vance's stories, who is a thief and a liar and a lot of other things. But while both, say, both Michael Moorcock and Roger Zelazny bring to the field, there is psychological depth to their characters, or at least, I don't want to say psychological depth, but a psychological lens to how they describe their characters. Now, Moorcock takes a different approach, and when I'm going to talk about Eternal Champion stories, which is certainly something that I can do in the near future if you guys are interested, Roger Zelazny does so very explicitly by mentioning psychological, somebody calls them shrinks, somebody calls them psychologists. He literally references Sigmund Freud at the time. It's at some point in this book. He does really use psychological terminology to talk about the characters in his book. And that is something that we don't see in a lot of earlier fantasy. Now, Tolkien doesn't have an interest in that, right? Tolkien doesn't do that because he looks at things through a mythological lens. And personalities are not that big a deal in that sort of lens. Robert E. Howard and the likes don't do that because their approach is another one. Conan and a lot of other Howard creations are fairly existentialist characters. They try to assert their will on the universe. While that may make them, morally grey in a lot of cases, and it's very clear that Conan is one of the more greyish characters out there, there's still no psychological language to talk about what makes those people into the people they are. Zelazny moves beyond that. And we have an interesting aspect here because we have the generational aspect in it. Now, people like those of you who have read, say, the Malazan Book of the Fallen and stuff like that, you already know that those books take a lot of interest in how the parent-child relationship may influence those in the future. And there's a paragraph or a part here in this novel in the Guns of Avalon where Corwin thinks about how the relationship to his father, Oberon. Another one of those wonderful like Shakespeare references, right? Never really, showed his kids any, parental love. He just like, provided for them, but tried to keep, his distance, and how they all have different mothers with like different approaches to child rearing as well, and how that may have made their family so bloody dysfunctional. So there's awareness that a parent-child relationship has an influence on how children, how people evolve in later life, for example. And it's those things that I feel we get more awareness of, or a larger focus on, with books like The Chronicles of Amber and, other stuff that comes later, psychological nuances there. And as I said, like a psychological lens, which means you use terminology from that field. And there's obviously like another reason there. Psychology made its way into, what you might call popular awareness over those days. It's not something that people brought up in the 1910s or 20s thought about that much. That's the point. Like in the 60s, people had read, like some people at least, had read their Jung, they had read their Freud, they had maybe even read their Joseph Campbell, who is heavy on the Jung, right? So that's just one reason on why we have these views there, because what we see a lot of times in like general popular culture and like general human history, I guess, is like that we have new developments that become popular in science that are finally accepted by the rest of society, and they become then the lens that we, look through for everything. And it's just like how we as people are work out. Like we find a new solution to some big problem of human existence or the universe, and then we apply that method to everything. So it's like when people first discovered physics, suddenly everything was solved by physics. When people got into academic chemistry in like the 19th century, suddenly everything was all about chemistry, and you could solve everything by adding powders to stuff and shit, right? Same with psychology, which is a discipline, an academic discipline that starts in the 19th century with people like Brentano and so forth, and then moves on into and at that point it is still very much considered part of philosophy, all the way until like the beginning of the 20th century. You have that whole phenomenology part that is very much part of philosophy, but also starts being the background out of which psychology emerges before moving firmly into a more medicine-based discipline. But both people like Jung and Freud are still very heavily influenced by philosophy and literature, which is, why Freud got a Nobel Prize for literature and not exactly for, medicine or anything like that. And all of that influences writers when they write these books. So it's not a big surprise that people like Zelazny or Moorcock look at their characters through a more psychological lens. It's still, I feel, worth pointing out at this point in time, because we've gotten so used to it at this point that we, tend to forget that was not always the case. Which, once again, is very much why these books read so modern in a lot of ways. I feel rereading this right now is like, it's been like a decade when I read them the first time, I feel, something like that. Over a decade, because I remember where I lived when I read them. Point is, their language, their prose, the way they approach things is thoroughly modern. It doesn't even try to be archaic in a way that, say, Tolkien sometimes tries to be. It doesn't try to be edgy in a way that someone like Richard K. Morgan or someone like Joe Abercrombie tries to be with their prose, right? No, it's very much the prose of the times. And if you've read authors like other authors or watched movies, other pieces of art from the 60s, 70s, that's the kind of prose they're using. Contemporary prose, I guess, is what you might call it. Contemporary for the time. And I'm still amazed on how easy these books read right now. Another interesting aspect that we see here, and there's more of it certainly in other books to come, and I feel is important to look out for here as well, is sexuality. Why? When we look at the classics, so to speak, of fantasy, they have a fairly odd relationship, or like a fairly odd perspective on sexuality. You look at Lord of the Rings or Tolkien's writing, it doesn't show up at all. Yes, there is love, but it barely ever happens, and that's about it. No one gets laid in Lord of the Rings. Ever. Yes, in the appendix, basically, Sam gets some, but that's about it. And we can assume that possibly Aragorn got some as well. But, you know, it doesn't make, he doesn't need to be in Lord of the Rings, because once again, we're on like a mythological level, so it doesn't have to be in there that much. But, yeah, it's it shows up through not showing up. When we look at someone like Robert E. Howard's writing, while the Conan rescues rescues a almost naked woman in almost every single story, we usually just like cut out of it before he actually gets anything on with them. He just like rescues them, and they cling to his knees in a way that will get Robert E. Howard the cover illustration for the next Weird Tales edition, because that pays a bit better. But we never talk about sexuality, actually. With, you know, Lovecraft even less, because gods, that guy was a mess of everything. And the only, like, probably only author that has a fairly conspicuous approach to sexuality of, like, the 30s, 40s authors is Fritz Leiber. Farfet and the Grey Mouser do have a fairly active sex life, to the point where it can almost become very uncomfortable, especially in later books when they are rather old and have no problem with a huge age difference with whoever they just get into bed at that point. But apart from that, a lot of that, you know, sexuality doesn't show up. Or if it shows up, it oftentimes gets it uses very flowery language to not really talk about it. It's sort of a form of prudishness, I guess, that is once again connected to the times. What we're talking about here is stories written in like 1970, 1972. We've gone past the summer of love. People have discovered sexual organs, and that it is possible to actually use them for all kinds of fun things that go beyond mere reproduction. And that also shows up in this book in a way. Because while there is sexuality in these stories, especially, I mean, we mostly get Corvin here, it's very interesting to see what kind of sexuality it is. It is a very casual, almost, jaded kind of sexuality. He gets, you know, he has sex with the Queen of Repma all the way in the beginning, which is a very casual thing. He shows up, apparently he's good looking, and people like him because he's like almost one of the most powerful people in the country, so she's like, yeah, let's have some fun, and that's it. And then we have a very interesting relationship in Lorraine with the woman called Lorraine, which is interesting for a number of reasons, including the way she is a, you know, more adult person and has a fairly realistic, if not jaded, look on sexuality as well. And we have that, and the way how in a more adult relationship, you know, understanding can come from the past and the hurts of the past that people carry with themselves, which is it's almost a miniature within these stories, because we have these more or less distinct parts in this second narrative, right? And then we continue to Corwin getting it on with Dara, who he assumes is the 17-year-old granddaughter of his brother Benedict. And that's kind of weird in a lot of ways, and will probably not fly today. But I still think it's interesting, because what we see here is that Corwin goes into that, and he's fully aware of the fact that it's kind of fucked up what he's doing. And it comes around and bites him in the ass. He knows that he's done wrong, and turns out, yeah, she was actually evil. But it's very important, I feel, and like a fairly modern approach to this, because we're talking like, we're talking about like ages where we still have the idea that, in situations like that, it's usually the woman seducing the man who can no longer, hold back his instincts or whatever. And it's nice to see this happening here in a way where Corwin is fully aware of the fact that it's basically him doing this in a way that because of the power difference and everything. It's not spelled out in a way that you might see it spelled out today, but he's fairly aware of the fact that he kind of does stuff that is not really okay there. So we have all of that as another thing that mostly wasn't possible to be explored in that way before, say, the 1960s, 1970s. And to be fair, with the Pfaffert and Grey Mouse's stories, it's also important to look at in which time they were written, because they were written over, basically 30, almost 40 years of time. So attitudes towards sexuality shifted over that time a lot as well. So I guess it's interesting to have that perspective here as well. Now let's look at the actual other thing here, and that is obviously the death curse that we need to, examine a bit more. Because what we see here is that power to destroy. And now, don't get me wrong, but I feel it's important to understand that the idea of the death curse or blood curse or whatever you want to call it, which has made its way into pop culture, into culture in general. Wizards can curse people on their death. You find it in, say, The Dragon Waiting that I recently read. You find it in Dresden Files, where Harry Dresden is always claiming that he'll use it if someone will, and so forth, right? It's in there, but there's a basis to that, and that is that if you bring someone to that other, like, utter end of hope and everything, where you're like, yeah, I have nothing to lose anymore. In that situation, humanity, while being capable in the positive sense of wonderful things and, feats of glorious bravery and whatnot, is also capable of insane levels of destruction. And if you then multiply that by magical power or whatever, it gets pretty much world-shattering. And that's exactly what Corwin did there. And now he has to actually face that. And I think it's a fairly clever way. We're talking about a 5-part story here, like with 5 novels. And it's all the way until the end of book 2, until we realize what this is about. It's not about Corwin becoming king of Amber. That's not the point. It's about Corwin fucking it up and then trying to solve or save the world that he personally, through his curse, has doomed. Through his curse and his, less than stellar behavior when it comes to sexuality. That's how he has basically cursed everyone on that way, and now he needs to take responsibility. It's very much a story about growing up that has nothing to do with age, because Corwin is like centuries old, millennia old probably, and that, I feel, makes for an interesting approach. All right, now we need to look at the final bit here, which is once again the idea with Avalon and the idea of shadows. That shadows are possible worlds in a multiverse, and maybe reflections of an ideal city, Amber. There's obviously a lot of Platonism going on there, if you want to look at it that way. I mean, Amber is sort of like the Platonic ideal of a city, and everything else are different reflections. Now, is there a reason why the pattern of which all of this is built is located in a cave? Is there some cheeky Plato referencing going on? I don't know. It's possible that I'm reading too much into it, but I doubt it. The point is that with that idea, you can, because all the possible worlds that show up in literature, that show up in fantasy, are all possible shadows in the world in the universe of Amber. We even have the idea that people like Corwin, the true Princess of Amber, can create shadows by walking towards them and imagining them. Sort of, it's never fully explained, but the question there is, if we assume that the world of Avalon is a shadow, the original world of Avalon, with Lancelot and all the other crazy stuff from Arthurian legend that we know there, if that is a shadow that possibly Corwin created, does that make Corwin an artist? And artists do play a role here. We have the mad artist Dworkin who can create those portals and stuff. But the question is, does not this concept of a universe make artists basically like Princess of Amber, who can create all kinds of worlds that are more or less similar to what we live in, just that our world in this like alternative would be the perfect world, or the best of all possible worlds, I guess. Which leads to like that sort of like reflection with what it is to create art, with what it is to create fantasies. And Corwin is supposed to also be a poet and he's composing music. He's a songwriter and he's a composer and he's a writer, a poet. He is an artist, and I assume almost all Princes of Amber are artists, because I'm aware of other scenes in later books where that is sort of the case, where artists, where other Princes of Amber and Princesses of Amber do like conduct art in a way. So that's just like a reflection that we'll go back to in future. In future installations of this, when we talk about the next one possibly, which we'll do tomorrow. It's called Sign of the Unicorn, so you can look forward to something there. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have, thank you very, very much. If you enjoyed the Chronicles of Amber, let me know your thoughts about it, and we can, talk more, because talking more is always good, right? Anyway, have a great day. I'll see you soon. Cheers.